In the 1600s, one of the richest businesses on Earth ran on a single human supply chain. Captives taken inland marched to the coast and shipped across the Atlantic. Forts rose, alliances were bought, and entire regions were pushed into chaos, because every raid meant profit for someone far away. Many rulers faced that storm and were forced to choose between two terrible options: submit and become a pipeline, or resist and risk being erased. But one leader refused to accept the choice as written. When war was necessary, she fought. When negotiation could save lives, she negotiated. When her enemies tried to remove her, she didn't vanish. She relocated, rebuilt, and returned stronger. She outlasted commanders, outlasted governors, and turned survival itself into a strategy. This is not a story about a queen who stood tall for one moment. This is the story of a woman who kept a kingdom standing for decades while an empire tried to bend it to its knees. Her name was Queen Nzinga. Nzinga, also known in many sources as Njinga, was born around 1583, into the royal world of the Mbundu people in the kingdom of Ndongo. Ndongo was not a small village polity. It was part of a complex political landscape of Central Africa where rulers negotiated power through diplomacy, warfare, trade, marriage ties, and alliances with neighboring states. Ndongo's ruler carried the title Angola, a title that mattered so much that outsiders later used a version of it to name the entire region, Angola. Long before European flags were planted, Ndongo and its neighbors were already operating as states with armies, courts, laws, and international relationship. But by Nzinga's lifetime, a new force had entrenched itself on the coast. The Portuguese had arrived in the late 1400s and 1500s along parts of Central Africa's Atlantic edge, initially through contact and trade, and then increasingly through military pressure and colonizing ambition. In 1575, they established Luanda as a permanent base. Over time, Luanda became more than a port. It became a machine. It connected inland conflicts to Atlantic demand, and it helped turn political instability into a steady flow of human beings sold into the transatlantic slave trade. This is the world Nzinga grew up in, a world where Portuguese governors spoke of peace while building forts, where missionaries spoke of salvation, while wars expanded, where treaties could be offered one day and broken the next. It was a world where decisions made in royal councils could determine whether communities stayed intact or were scattered across an ocean. Nzinga's father, Ngola Kaluanji, ruled Ndongo during years when Portuguese pressure intensified. Military campaigns and political manipulation threatened Ndongo's autonomy, and the Portuguese often attempted to control the region by supporting rival claimants, encouraging internal division, and rewarding those willing to supply captives. In that environment, intelligence mattered as much as bravery. Nzinga appears in historical accounts as unusually capable, someone trained not just to observe politics but to shape them. She learned early that empire does not only attack with guns. It attacks with paperwork, with promises, with staged humiliation, and with the slow tightening of economic dependency. When Nzinga's father died, her brother, Ngola became ruler. His reign was dominated by crisis. Portuguese forces and their allies pushed into Ndongo's sphere, and raids and wars destabilized communities. Internal strain grew, as it often does when a kingdom is fighting externally and struggling internally at the same time. Mbandi needed leverage. He needed time. He needed a negotiator who could meet Portuguese officials as something other than a subordinate. And so, in 1622, he sent Nzinga to Luanda. This meeting in Luanda became one of the defining scenes of Nzinga's legend, and it matters not only because of what happened, but because it reveals how power works. In many retellings, Portuguese officials attempted to put Nzinga beneath them symbolically by offering no chair for her, expecting her to sit on the floor while the governor sat elevated. The most famous version says Nzinga responded by having an attendant kneel and using the attendant as a seat, placing herself eye level with the governor. Historians note that details like this can be shaped by later storytelling, yet the reason the scene remains powerful is that it captures something real about her approach. She refused to negotiate from a posture of humiliation. Even in an enemy's room, she insisted on being treated as a sovereign. In Luanda, Nzinga negotiated hard. She sought recognition of Ndongo's authority, pressed for limits on Portuguese aggression, and demanded the return of certain captives. During these negotiations she accepted baptism, taking the Christian name Dona Ana de Souza. It is important to understand what conversion could mean in that era. It could be spiritual, but it could also be diplomatic language, a way to reduce a colonizer's excuse for war and to open channels of negotiation. European powers frequently wrapped conquest in religious justification. Nzinga was willing to use that same religious vocabulary as a tool, not as a chain. She returned from Luanda having gained something precious: time. But time is not safety. Portuguese expansion did not function like a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a treaty. It functioned like a system designed to grow. Forts expanded, alliances were cultivated against Ndongo, and the demand for captives continued to warp the region's politics. Conflict reignited, and Ndongo's stability weakened further. In 1624, after the death of her brother, Nzinga took power. The transition was turbulent, and the surviving accounts, many written by Portuguese observers or missionaries, often describe events with bias, rumor, and political motives. What is clear is that Nzinga emerged as the central leader at a moment when the Portuguese were actively working to remove any ruler who could not be controlled. They supported rival claimants and tried to install leadership that would cooperate with colonial goals. Nzinga, by her very existence as a strategist and a resistor, was unacceptable to them. Nzinga's early reign faced immediate military and political assault. Portuguese forces advanced. Allied local groups were used to pressure her position. Some communities were forced to flee. Ndongo's ability to resist as it once had was compromised. This is where many rulers would have collapsed, been captured, or been replaced. Nzinga did something different. She adapted her geography. She shifted her base of power to Matamba, a neighboring kingdom inland. This move was not a retreat of shame. It was a strategic repositioning. Nzinga understood a truth that keeps states alive. If holding one capital means losing your people, then the capital is not worth the loss. She chose mobility over pride, and survival over symbolism. From Matamba, she rebuilt. Matamba became more than a hiding place. Under Nzinga, it became a center of resistance, a state capable of absorbing refugees and reorganizing communities displaced by wars and raid. She strengthened its military, reinforced its political structure, and turned it into a kingdom that could fight, negotiate, and endure. In an era of constant danger, endurance itself was a weapon. Nzinga's military and political alliances during this period were complex. Some accounts describe her engaging with warrior groups known in the region and adopting certain military methods that were effective but harsh. War in that era was not clean, and the boundaries between defense, expansion, and survival were often blurred. What must be kept in view is the core pressure driving the region's devastation: the growing Atlantic market for enslaved people and the colonial system being built to feed it. Portuguese campaigns, Allied raids, and the militarization of capture all intensified because human beings had become a commercial export. Nzinga did not fight only with spears and muskets. She fought with diplomacy and psychological pressure. She communicated with different factions, made and broke alliances when necessary, and used the politics of the region as a chessboard rather than a straight road. She also understood that Europeans were not a single united force. Portugal had enemies. European rivalries could become African opportunities. That opportunity came in the 1640s. The Dutch, locked in competition with Portugal for trade and power, attacked Portuguese holdings. In 1641, Dutch forces captured Luanda. For Portugal, the loss of Luanda threatened their entire colonial project in the region. For Nzinga, it was the opening she had waited for. Nzinga allied with the Dutch, aiming to break Portuguese control inland and reclaim lost ground. This alliance was not born from love or illusion. The Dutch were also involved in Atlantic commerce, and their interests were their own. But Nzinga's strategy was clear. If Portugal is weakened, Ndongo and Matamba gain room to breathe. She pushed military campaigns to exploit Portuguese vulnerability, and for a time the balance shifted. Yet history rarely grants a single clean victory. In 1648, the Portuguese recaptured Luanda, restoring their coastal base and reviving their ability to project force inland. Nzinga's window narrowed again. The struggle returned to what it had always been, a long contest against a system that could replace governors and soldiers but maintained the same goal: control. Nzinga continued. She fought when she had to. She negotiated when it was useful. She built Matamba into a durable kingdom that could function even under pressure. She did not measure victory only by how much land she held on a map. She measured it by whether her people remained a people, whether her state still had a center, whether her authority could survive the empire's attempt to erase it. This is also where honest history requires maturity. Nzinga is rightly remembered as a symbol of resistance to Portuguese imperial domination and to the enslavement machine it fed. At the same time, the region's politics were entangled in war economies, and forms of captivity existed in multiple societies, as they did across much of the pre-modern world. What European expansion did was scale, weaponize, and export human captivity into an Atlantic industry, intensifying conflict and incentivizing raid. Nzinga's state, like others, operated inside that violent environment. Recognizing complexity does not diminish her. It clarifies what she was up against. Not a single battle, but a world system being built in real time, with human lives as fuel. Over the decades, Nzinga also returned to religious diplomacy in ways that strengthened her position. She re-engaged with Christianity and missionaries later in life, using the language of faith and legitimacy to stabilize relations and strengthen her standing in negotiations. Again, belief and strategy were not always separate in that era. A ruler could use religion to unify internally and to speak in a language Europeans pretended was the only civilized language. Nzinga understood that Europeans used moral claims as weapons. She refused to let them keep that weapon to themselves. By the 1650s, Nzinga was an elderly ruler, but not a diminished one. She had ruled through decades of war, rebuilding, and relentless political pressure. Eventually, in 1656, she signed a peace agreement with the Portuguese. This was not a fairy tale ending. It was a pragmatic outcome shaped by reality. Treaties could reduce raids, stabilize trade, and secure recognition that her rule and her kingdom could not simply be overwritten. It also allowed her to consolidate Matamba further and strengthen succession, ensuring the kingdom could endure beyond her lifetime. Nzinga died in 1663, likely in her 80s, after one of the longest and most consequential reigns of any African leader in that era. She left behind a state that continued, and a name that refused to fade. Portuguese officials and missionaries wrote about her because they could not ignore her. Communities remembered her because she symbolized something rare, a leader who did not confuse survival with surrender. To call Nzinga only a warrior is to tell half the truth. She was a warrior, yes, but she was also a diplomat who understood that a negotiation is a battlefield with different weapons. She was a strategist who recognized when the coast was too dangerous and the interior offered leverage. She was a nation builder who absorbed displaced people and turned crisis into cohesion. And she was a leader who understood symbolism, that sometimes the way you sit, the way you speak, and the way you refuse to be lowered can shift the entire meaning of a meeting. Her story matters because it corrects a lie. The lie says Africa had no power, no strategy, no statecraft, until outsiders arrive. Nzinga's life proves the opposite. She confronted empire with diplomacy, warfare, and long-term planning. She treated European expansion not as destiny, but as a problem to be solved. Her story also matters because it expands what leadership looks like. In the 1600s, in a region under intense pressure, a woman led armies, managed alliances, negotiated treaties, and held a kingdom together across decades. She was not a myth of possibility. She was a record of reality. Before America, before modern borders, before the Atlantic slave trade reached its full industrial horror, African leaders were already confronting the early waves of that storm. Queen Nzinga stood in it and refused to kneel. She did not win by pretending the danger wasn't real. She won time. She won space. She won survival. And in an age when empires expected African rulers to bow, she forced them to do something they hated most: recognize her as a sovereign equal, even when they tried to destroy her. This is before and beyond America. If you want more cinematic history with animated maps, exploring the empires, leaders, and turning points that shaped Africa and the diaspora, subscribe. Because the story of power did not begin with conquest, and it did not end with resistance.